On the morning of Thursday the 13th of August 1964, shortly after 8 o'clock, a small boy arrived at the main gate of Strangeways Prison, carrying 2 parcels of newspapers. He knocked at the prison door the way he presumably did every morning, a paper boy on his round, at the one address in Manchester where the news is delivered through a gate in a 40-foot wall. He got no reply. Nobody came. Across the road, a little knot of men and women had gathered, people who worked nearby, standing opposite the main entrance in the grey of the early morning. They were not demonstrating. They'd come, the papers said, because they were interested to see whether anyone else would. Nobody did. There were no banners at Strangeways that morning, no vigil, no hymns, just the boy with his newspapers, knocking at a door that did not open, and a handful of people across the street, watching a building that gave nothing away. At 8:05, the main doors opened at last, and scores of warders walked out into the morning, the night shift going home. And that was all. That was everything Manchester saw. What Manchester could not see was that a few minutes earlier, at 8 o'clock exactly, inside those walls, a 24-year-old man named Gwynne Owen Evans had been hanged, the 100th person to die on a Strangeways gallows since 1869, and the last person who ever would. And at this very same moment, 35 miles away, behind the walls of Walton Prison in Liverpool, the same thing had been done to his co-defendant, Peter Anthony Allen, who was 21. Nobody knew it yet. Not the paper boy, not the warders going home, not the 2 men's mothers, not the Home Secretary who had signed the papers, not even the hangmen themselves. But capital punishment in Britain had just ended. There would never be another hanging. The boy at the gate was knocking, though no one could have told him so, on the door of the last morning of its kind in this country's history. Last time, I told you how it came to this. A quiet man called Jack West, beaten and stabbed in his own hallway in a Cumberland village, and 2 young men from Preston, convicted of killing him, each swearing to the end that the other had done it. This episode is about everything that happened after the jury came back. The 5 weeks and 2 days between the verdict and the rope, and then the half-century after that. It's the story of how Britain stopped hanging people, told through the 2 people it hanged last. Welcome to Manchester Murders. I'm your host Susan, and today I'm concluding the story of John Allen West, and of Peter Anthony Allen and Gwynne Owen Evans, the 2 young men convicted of his murder, who on the 13th of August 1964 became the last people ever executed in Britain. This is the final part of our series on Strangeways. The appeal, the condemned cells, the fight for a reprieve, the last morning, and the long afterlife of that morning, down to 2017 when the files were finally opened. When we left them at the end of the last episode, the 2 men had just been sentenced to death at Manchester Crown Court and driven away in different directions. Allen to Walton Prison in Liverpool, Evans to Strangeways. Under the law as it stood, everything now had to happen quickly. A capital case moved on rails, and the rails were short. The appeal came within a fortnight before the Court of Criminal Appeal in London. The Lord Chief Justice, Lord Parker, sitting with Mr. Justice Wynne and Mr. Justice Widgery over the 20th and 21st of July. And here's the thing that should stop you, knowing what you know from the last episode about the state of Gwynne Evans' mind, and about the 3 doctors who had examined it. At the appeal, just as at the trial, Evans' lawyers made no attempt whatsoever to argue that he was not fully responsible for his actions. Diminished responsibility, dropped without explanation on the 2nd day of the trial, stayed dropped. It was never mentioned. Instead, his counsel Guthrie Jones QC attacked the evidence of Mary Allen on the basis that she was the wife of the co-accused and her testimony could not be relied upon. It went nowhere for a simple reason. The trial judge had already said exactly that to the jury, warning them to treat her evidence with caution. The point had been made, weighed, and absorbed at trial. The appeals were dismissed on the 21st of July. Lord Parker, giving judgment, said this of the crime: a more brutal murder it would be difficult to imagine. And of the question the whole trial had circled, which man's hand had actually killed Jack West, He offered the only formula the evidence would ever support. The parts the two men played were the subject of dispute, each attacking and blaming the other at the trial. The Crown's case had never needed to resolve it. The two of them had gone to that house together to rob a man, and the man had died under their attack. In law, that made them equally guilty and equally condemned. Who held the knife is a question that was disputed then, and it's unresolved now. On the 22nd of July, the Home Office announced the date. The executions would take place on Thursday the 13th of August, Allen at Liverpool, Evans at Manchester, both at once at 8 o'clock in the morning, in two prisons 35 miles apart. Behind that announcement, an older machinery was turning, a machinery of letters and fees and forms that had been turning in much the same way for centuries. Because Jack West had died in Cumberland, the duty of carrying out the sentence on Evans fell, formally, to the High Sheriff of Cumberland, and in the middle of July the Under-Sheriff was writing to Strangeways about prisoner number 11115, settling, among other things, the executioner's fee. It came to 15 guineas plus expenses, half of it retained for a fortnight after the event, pending the Governor's report that everything had been done properly. There's a whole world in that arrangement, if you let yourself see it. The death of a human being, invoiced, part payment withheld against satisfactory completion. In 1964, in England, this was simply how it was administered. With the appeal gone, one door remained, the royal prerogative of mercy, a reprieve granted on the advice of the Home Secretary. The Home Secretary in August 1964 was Henry Brooke, and for the next 3 weeks everything that could still be done for Peter Allen and Gwynne Evans arrived on his desk in the form of letters. The first was written on the 24th of July by Evans' solicitor, John Marsham of Midland Bank Chambers in Whitehaven, a Cumberland country solicitor writing to the Home Secretary of the United Kingdom with his client's life on a deadline. Marsham's letter made the argument that Evans' own barristers had twice failed to make. He pointed out that 3 doctors, the prisons, the defences and the prosecutions, had all agreed that Evans suffered from mental impairment. He enclosed something the jury had never seen, a statement from a Mr. Hampton, the father of a girl Evans had been seeing, who had put an end to the relationship because Evans' immaturity had worried him. Evans was, the statement said, completely childish in everything he did. He would make toys that a child would make and play with them for hours before pulling them to pieces. And Marsham addressed head-on the thing that had sunk his client. Evans had been shown in court to be a liar, he wrote, and that had made his conviction inevitable. Even in the witness box, he could not refrain from telling stupid and unnecessary lies. Among them, a pointless story about being chased by a police car. The letter's logic is quiet and terrible. This man lied so compulsively, so much against his own interest, that the lying itself was the symptom. The thing that had convinced the jury he was guilty was the very thing that suggested his mind was not right. The Home Office dismissed the letter, but it did commission one final medical assessment. 3 psychiatrists, Dr. Pickering, Dr. Mather and Professor Anderson, who visited Evans in the condemned cell at Strangeways on the 27th and 28th of July. He was a pallid, slightly built young man, clearly tense, tremulous, with knitted brows throughout the interview, they wrote. He admitted to them that he was a habitual liar, admitted indeed that he had lied to the doctors themselves. The prison staff reported the same. He lied often, they said, to boost his self-confidence. The Governor thought him a happy-go-lucky extrovert liking to stand high in people's favour. A sentence written about a man in a death cell. But nobody who watched him day and night thought him insane, and the panel found no sign of fits or transient losses or changes of consciousness. In the narrow terms the law asked about, that was that. Then, on the 3rd of August, Hannah Walby wrote. She was Evans' mother. The envelope survives in the National Archives, addressed in blue ink to the Home Secretary in London, marked urgent in capitals, postmarked Workington, 5:15 in the afternoon. Inside, in a round laboured hand, she made the case for her son's life. "I write to you on behalf of my son, who is under sentence of death at Manchester Prison," she began. He'd never been in serious trouble, she said, before he met this Preston couple. He'd been brought up in the church, a member of the choir and of the Boy Scouts. He'd been friends with Jack West for 5 years, often staying overnight at his house. And then the heart of it. "My son is mentally impaired, and I had him under a mental doctor at the age of 8 years, but he is not a wicked boy." She closed, "Please may God guide you to make a merciful judgement. I remain, yours respectfully, Mrs. H. Walby." 3 days later, on the 6th of August, Henry Brooke wrote on the file in red ink, "I've read these papers and spoken to the judge, and I regret I can find no mitigating circumstances such as would justify a reprieve in either case. The law must take its course. H.B. 6th 8th. 2 sentences and initials and a date. The decision was made that day, though the formal letters, regretting that the Home Secretary had failed to discover any sufficient ground for a reprieve, did not go out until the 10th, and the news did not reach the papers until the 11th, which means that for 4 days, while the families still waited and hoped, the answer was already sitting in the file, in red ink. On the same day that Brooke wrote those words, a deputation from the Campaign Against Capital Punishment arrived at the Home Office, carrying a reprieve petition of between 3,000 and 4,000 signatures. They were received courteously enough by a man who explained that he could not comment on anything because he was only a Home Office official. The campaigners went away believing and saying that these might be not just the first executions of the year, but quite possibly the last in the country's history. They would turn out to be right on both counts. But on the 6th of August 1964, nobody in the building they had just left could tell them so. To understand why so many people expected a reprieve, why the campaigners dared to hope these hangings would never happen, we should look at what the previous 10 years had done to this country's confidence in the rope. I promised you this story in the last episode. Here it is briefly, because it's the weather this whole story happens in. In 1950, a Welshman named Timothy Evans was hanged for the murder of his baby daughter at 10 Rillington Place in London, protesting his innocence and blaming the man downstairs. 3 years later, the man downstairs, John Christie, was found to have the bodies of 6 women hidden about that same house, and was hanged himself. The question of what had actually happened to Timothy Evans, whether England had hanged an innocent man on the evidence of a serial killer, settled into the national conscience like a splinter, and it's never come out. In 1953, a 19-year-old called Derek Bentley was hanged for the murder of a police officer, a murder committed by his 16-year-old friend who fired the shot but was too young to hang. Bentley, who was under arrest at the moment the trigger was pulled, and whose mental age was assessed at 11, died for 5 ambiguous words. "Let him have it, Chris." The public disquiet was enormous. And in 1955, Ruth Ellis, a young mother who had shot dead a lover who beat her, became the last woman hanged in Britain, and tens of thousands of people signed petitions for her. The Home Office let her hang anyway, and something in the public mood visibly turned. A royal commission had already spent 4 years examining capital punishment, and reported in 1953 that the law of murder was in a mess. The campaign for abolition, revived in the mid-50s around the newly founded National Campaign for the Abolition of Capital Punishment, grew respectable and then formidable. And in 1957, Parliament produced the compromise we met in the last episode, the Homicide Act, which kept the death penalty only for certain categories of murder, including murder in the course or furtherance of theft, and created the defence of diminished responsibility. After 1957, hangings dwindled to a handful a year. In 1963, there were 2 in the whole country. In 1964, there would be only Allen and Evans. And reprieve had become the norm, not the exception. In the Northwest, the expectation of mercy had a recent and specific shape. A Lancashire murderer, whose crime was notably brutal, had lately been reprieved, and Preston, the town both condemned men came from, had drawn the obvious conclusion. The police themselves, it was said, expected a reprieve. The families certainly did. In 1964, that's what happened to condemned men. They were sentenced, they appealed, they lost, and then quietly the sentence became life imprisonment. The machine still passed sentences of death. It had almost stopped carrying them out. So when the news broke on the 11th of August that there would be no reprieve for either man, it went against the grain of everything recent experience had taught people to expect. And in Preston, it set off something remarkable. Remarkable enough that a national newspaper devoted a report to it on the morning of the 12th, the men's last full day alive. A mercy petition had been raised in the town, carrying more than 1,000 signatures. But Preston had also produced something else, a counter-petition. 108 signatures urging that the two men should hang, believed, the paper said, to be the first demand of its kind ever made. It was sent to the town's two Conservative MPs, Julian Amery and Alan Green, and it demanded the return of hanging for all murders. A local councillor, Joseph Holden, put the counter-petitioner's feeling into a sentence. Many people will be sorry if they ever see the abolition of capital punishment. On the other side stood the curate of Preston Parish Church, the Reverend Grimes, who had organised the reprieve effort, and who answered, "This whole pro-hanging campaign is one of hate and danger." A town of two condemned men's families, petitioning in both directions at once, and the newspaper that reported it closed with a paragraph of plain political forecasting. The two men, it noted, might be the last ever hanged in Britain, because if a Labour government were returned at the coming general election, capital punishment was expected to be abolished. That was in print on the 12th of August. The election was 2 months away. The scaffold was beating the ballot box by 8 weeks. While Preston petitioned, the practical arrangements proceeded, and the practical arrangements in England meant 2 men with suitcases. The man appointed to hang Gwynne Evans at Strangeways was Harry Allen, no relation to the condemned Peter Allen, though the coincidence of names has confused accounts of the case for 60 years. Harry Allen belongs to this series in a way that's almost uncomfortably neat. He was a Manchester area man. Born in Yorkshire in 1911, he was raised in Ashton-under-Lyne, drove buses for the Ashton Corporation as a young man, and spent his working life as a publican in towns north of the city, at Farnworth, and then at the Junction Inn at Whitefield. His customers knew what he did. It was never a secret exactly. It was simply not discussed. He'd been on the Home Office list since 1941, serving for 14 years as an assistant, most often to Albert Pierpoint, the most famous hangman in English history, and another Manchester publican, in one of those details you would hesitate to put in fiction. Among the executions at which Harry Allen assisted was that of Derek Bentley in 1953. From 1956, after Pierpoint's resignation, Allen served as one of the country's 2 chief executioners, and the biggest jobs of the death penalty's last years passed through his hands. James Hanratty in 1962, the last man hanged in Northern Ireland, the last man hanged in Scotland. At work he wore a bow tie, as a sign of respect, he said. He would say, in later years, that he'd never felt a moment's remorse about any of it. The other chief executioner was Robert Leslie Stewart, and to him fell Peter Allen at Walton. 2 prisons, 2 hangmen, 1 moment. The Home Office had arranged the executions to be simultaneous, 8 o'clock on the 13th of August, in Manchester and Liverpool at once. Neither man would die first. Neither family would hear a church clock strike, knowing the other's son had a minute left. On the afternoon of the 12th, Mary Allen came to Walton to see her husband for the last time, the wife whose evidence had helped convict him, saying goodbye through the barrier of a prison visit. Something happened in that room. The accounts of it differ in their details. One version has Peter Allen hurling himself at the glass partition that separated them, breaking the glass. Another has him smashing his hand against a wall. But they agree on what was left. He had injured his hand badly, and when the morning came, it was still in a bandage. That same day, the two mothers, Hannah Walby and Peter Allen's mother, sent a telegram to the Queen at Balmoral, pleading for clemency on account of their sons' ages, 21 and 24. It was the last move left on the board, and it changed nothing. At Walton, they kept vigil all night. 2 campaigners against capital punishment stood outside the prison through the small hours of the 13th of August, holding banners. "No more hanging," one read. The other, "Why take another life?" At 7:30 in the morning, they were joined by 3 teenage girls from Liverpool who took a turn holding the banners. 3 girls who'd got up in the dark on a summer Thursday to stand outside a prison wall while a man they had never met was hanged behind it. By 8 o'clock there were about 40 people at the gates, a dozen of them pressmen. Among the campaigners were Robert Burt, a 44-year-old farmer from near Bristol, who chaired the movement's branch there, and Roger Moody, who was 21, exactly the age of the man inside. Leaflets were handed out, headed "Hanging's no answer," and they made the argument in its sharpest available form. If these 2 men had killed Jack West in exactly the way they did, but had stolen nothing, they could not have been sentenced to death at all. As 8 o'clock struck on a church clock nearby, one man in the crowd removed his cap. Burt and Moody stood with their heads bowed. There were, the reports said, no scenes. At Strangeways there was nothing at all. No vigil, no banners, only the people who worked nearby, gathered opposite the main entrance to see whether any demonstration would happen, and the paper boy, shortly after 8, knocking at the door with his 2 bundles and getting no reply. And at 8:05 the doors opening and the night shift warders coming out. The vigils that morning were not only at the prison gates, because by 1964 a campaign against capital punishment was a national network, and it marked the morning wherever it stood. In Bristol, 6 campaigners kept silence outside the cathedral from 10 to 8 until 1:15. Their branch chairman was George Gummer, and he gave the press 2 statements that day, similar in feeling, different in words, and both of them preserved. To one paper he said, "These were 2 sick young men, and some other method than legalised murder must be found to deal with people like them." To another, "In my opinion, the Home Secretary has destroyed 2 sick young men. It's legalised euthanasia." In Leeds, 16 people stood for half an hour. Small numbers everywhere. A handful here, 40 there. Whatever this morning was, it was not a mass movement in the streets. It was a scattering of people standing quietly outside locked buildings at the hour the state had named. Inside the 2 prisons at 8 o'clock it was done, simultaneously as arranged. Robert Stewart hanged Peter Allen at Walton. His last word as Stewart strapped him is said to have been, "Jesus." Harry Allen hanged Gwynne Evans at Strangeways at the same moment. His last words are not recorded. Each hangman had assistants as the procedure required. Their names were never officially announced, and the accounts that survive disagree about who stood where, so I'll leave them unnamed, which is, after all, how the state itself preferred it. At 9:42 that morning, a telegram went from Strangeways to Whitehall, from the Governor to the Under-Secretary of State. It's in the National Archive, strips of teleprinted tape pasted to a form, and it reads in capitals, "The execution of Gwynne Owen Evans was carried out at 8 a.m. today." The Home Office issued its public announcement in a single sentence. The sentences of death passed on Peter Anthony Allen and Gwynne Owen Evans at Manchester Crown Court on July the 7th were carried out at Liverpool and Manchester at 8 a.m. today. And here's the thing that everyone who writes about this case eventually has to sit with. There was no sense, on the 13th of August 1964, of a door closing on 1,000 years of English history. The press interest was modest. 2 obscure young men hanged for a sordid robbery murder in the holiday season. The Daily Mail's headline gave the story 3 words, "Cosh pair hanged," and a report of the 2 prison gates that morning, the vigil at Walton, the nothing at Strangeways, the paper boy, the warders. The papers reported it and moved on. There were no crowds of the kind that had gathered for Ruth Ellis, no national argument in that morning's news. The last hangings in British history were carried out almost without an audience in 2 northern prisons before breakfast, and the country found out only gradually, over the months and years that followed, that it had been present, or rather absent, at an ending. Almost without an audience, because one newspaper that very morning understood exactly what it was looking at. On the morning of the 13th of August, printed overnight, distributed while the 2 men were still alive, on sale as the clocks struck 8, the Daily Herald carried a leader under a 5-word headline: "Let these hangings be the last." The 2 men, it noted, may be dead already as you read these words. And then it laid out, for a mass readership, the same incomprehensible arithmetic the campaigners' leaflets were making at the Walton gates at that very hour. If they'd killed their victim in exactly the same way, but not to steal, the sentence would have been life imprisonment. The law's conclusion, it stated flatly: a law that balances life and death in such incomprehensible scales has no basis in morality. And it ended: total abolition must be the next step. Let it be soon. I want to be clear about what I'm doing here, because this podcast does not editorialise, and it's not going to start in its most consequential episode. I'm not telling you what to think about capital punishment. I'm telling you what was said at the time by the people who were there. And the people who were there did not speak with one voice. You've already heard Councillor Holden and the 108 signatures of the Preston counter petition. Here's one more voice, and it may be the one that stays with you the longest. The day after the executions, in Preston's Market Square, the Reverend Grimes led 23 people in half an hour of silent meditation, a closing of the vigil the town's abolitionists had kept, and a woman came up to them. Her name was Mrs. Emily Hammond of Murdoch Avenue, and 3 years earlier her niece had been shot dead in the town. She said, "I'm disgusted with you. See if you would like it if one of your children was shot at your door." Another woman put it more shortly: "Mr. Grimes should keep his mouth shut." There's no answer to Mrs. Hammond in this episode, and I'm not going to manufacture one. She'd buried a murdered niece, and she watched 23 people stand in respectful silence for 2 convicted killers, and she said what she felt. If you want to understand why capital punishment survived in British public opinion for decades after it vanished from British law, why, as we shall see, it very nearly came back, why even now some still call for its return, you do not need a political history. You need Mrs. Hammond in the Market Square on the 14th of August 1964. Any honest account of this story keeps her in it. The Daily Herald's forecast held. In October 1964, Labour won the general election, narrowly, and among the new government's backbenchers was Sidney Silverman, the member for Nelson and Colne, a tenacious Lancashire MP who had spent the better part of 20 years trying to abolish the death penalty, and who now, at last, had the arithmetic on his side. 4 months after the Strangeways gallows were used for the last time, Silverman's murder, abolition of death penalty bill came before the Commons, to reported cheers from the benches at its first reading on the 5th of December, and on its second reading, on the 21st, it passed by 355 votes to 170. It was a free vote, a matter of conscience, not of party, and the margin was more than 2 to 1. The bill received royal assent on the 8th of November 1965 and came into force the next day. From the 9th of November 1965, no one in Britain could be sentenced to death for murder. The Act was, on its face, an experiment, abolition for 5 years, and in December 1969, Parliament voted to make it permanent. Some details from those transitional months deserve to be said aloud. 17 more people were sentenced to death after Allen and Evans in the 15 months before abolition took effect, and every one of them was reprieved. The last of them, a young man named David Chapman, sentenced in November 1965, days before the Act came into force, for a murder committed, as it happened, in the course of a robbery. The same crime in law as the murder of Jack West. The identical charge that had hanged Allen and Evans a year earlier now ended automatically in a commuted sentence. Whatever line separates the last 2 men hanged in Britain from the 17 who followed them, It's not a line of guilt or of cruelty or of law. It's a line of dates. And there's one more date to set beside these because this podcast has been to this territory before. In October 1965, 1 month before abolition, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley were arrested. The Moors murders, which this series covered in episode 24, became the first great test of a Britain without the rope. The most reviled killers in the country's modern history, tried in the spring of 1966, months after the death penalty for murder had gone. They were sentenced to life, and the country had to learn what life meant. And in the general election of 1966, in Silverman's own constituency of Nelson and Colne, a man named Patrick Downey stood against him on a single issue, the return of hanging. Downey was the uncle of Leslie Ann Downey, one of the murdered children. He polled more than 5,000 votes, nearly 14%, one of the most striking single-issue votes ever recorded in a British constituency. Silverman held the seat, but 5,000 of his neighbours had walked to a polling station specifically to tell him what they thought of what he had done. Abolition, in other words, was an act of Parliament. It was never a settlement of the public mind, and that distinction is the thread that runs through everything that follows. What happens to a story like this one after the law moves on? It becomes, by turns, a book, a debate, a quiz question, and a wound. Let me take those in order because the afterlife of the 13th of August 1964 is a history of Britain arguing with itself, and this case is the coin it kept arguing over. The book came first. In 1966, the writer Elwyn Jones published The Last Two to Hang, the first full account of the case, serialised that September in the Liverpool Echo. One review of it caught, in a single headline phrase, the thing that makes this case so unsettling, murder so ordinary that led to the last hangings. That's the truth this series has been circling for 5 episodes. The 100 people hanged at Strangeways were not, for the most part, the monsters of legend. The last of them died for £10, a wristwatch, and a pair of bank books. Another book that year, A History of the Gallows itself, allowed itself a valediction. After 1,000 years, its author wrote, civilization had at last triumphed. And one reviewer added, dryly, that there were people who would still dispute that last statement. The reviewer had the better of it. There would be, for a very long time. By 1975, it was a quiz question, one of the teasers in a Liverpool paper's weekend feature. Who were the last men hanged in Britain? 11 years and the ending of a 1,000-year institution had become pub trivia, but the argument itself refused to close. Parliament returned to hanging again and again over the following decades. There were attempts to restore it for terrorism, for the murder of police officers, for child murder, and the most serious of them came in July 1983, in the first year of Margaret Thatcher's second term, when the Commons debated restoration, category by category, including the very one that had hanged Allen and Evans, murder in the course of theft. The Church of England's General Synod had voted against restoration by 407 votes to 36. A television phone-in poll of 28,000 callers split 52 to 48 in favour of bringing it back. That's where the country stood, 19 years after Strangeways. Institutions against the rope, public opinion still, narrowly, for it. And at a press conference held that month by MPs campaigning for restoration, reporters found a 66-year-old woman from Workington. It was Hannah Walby, the mother whose letter to the Home Secretary you heard earlier in this episode, the woman who had begged God to guide Henry Brooke to a merciful judgement for her son. 19 years on, she told the press she believed hanging ought to be brought back, especially, she said, for the murders of children and old age pensioners. I'm not going to gloss over that. I could offer you 6 readings of it, and every one of them would be an invention. Here's what the record holds. In 1964, she wrote, "He's not a wicked boy," to the man who could save her son. And in 1983, she stood with the campaign to restore the thing that killed him. Both of those are true, and she was under no obligation to make them consistent for us. Grief is not required to have a position. Every restoration motion in that 1983 debate was defeated, as was every one that came after. The last serious attempt, in 1988, went down by more than 100 votes, with the Prime Minister herself voting for restoration. The rope never came back. The argument simply, slowly, wore out. The people wore on. In 1989, 25 years after he'd led the vigil in Preston Market Square, the Reverend Grimes was still in the town and was still remembered, not always kindly. The abusive letters, he recalled, had arrived in great piles. The vigil itself had been moved after ex-servicemen objected to its standing at the cenotaph. His bishop had backed him. He was still pleased, he said, that they had taken a stand. And of the woman who had confronted him in the square, he was gentler than she had been with him. He could understand the aunt, he said, could understand why people felt so bitter. Mary Allen, the wife, the witness, the woman whose evolving evidence had run through the whole trial, remarried. Her second husband was Billy Price, who had been a close friend of Peter Allen and who adopted the two boys. Mark grew up believing Billy was his father. Mary died in 1980, still only in her 30s, and by the account her son later gave, she took most of the story with her. Mark had learned the outline at 13 from a friend whose mother had been gossiping that his real father had been hanged. His mother confirmed it and would say no more, only that she had promised to sit down and tell him everything when he was old enough. That conversation never happened. It was 2014, 50 years after the executions, before Mark Price, a married man with 4 children and grandchildren of his own, finally learned the whole of it, and learned from a newspaper the detail his mother had kept from him entirely, that on the night of the murder, he and his baby brother had been there, asleep, in the stolen car outside Jack West's house. "I was there? I was in the car?" was all he could say at first. What he said when he had absorbed it is worth hearing, because it resists every tidy expectation. He defended his mother without hesitation. She would never have been there had she known, he said. She was the gentlest of women, and she'd hidden his history to protect him. He called what was done to his father an injustice, said the case had been pushed through for political reasons, and wished he could tell him so. And in the same breath he said that he believed in capital punishment, for the clear-cut cases, he said. The killers with the sole intent to kill, just not for a robbery gone wrong, not for his father. He'd tried, he said, to imagine his father's last days, the realization, the bandaged hand, the mourning, and found it too horrific to hold in his mind. He was a father himself now, and it was the thought of leaving your children behind, with that stigma and no chance to make amends, that defeated him. And after 50 years of not looking, he ended somewhere simple. His father had done something wrong and been punished for it, he said, but he's still my father. The son of the last man hanged in Britain, half a supporter of hanging. If you came to this story expecting the aftermath to sort its people into neat camps, the Prices and the Wolbys are where that expectation goes to die. There are 2 more endings to record from those years, one legal and one human. The legal one came in 1992, and not in England, but on the Isle of Man, where the death penalty for murder remained on the statute book long after Great Britain had abandoned it. A man named Tyr was convicted of murder, and the court went through the old form, the sentence of death pronounced from the bench, in the certain knowledge that it would be commuted, as every such sentence there had been for decades. It was the last death sentence ever passed in the British Isles. A ritual by then, a form of words with the current switched off. And the human ending. Harry Allen, the Whitefield publican who had hanged Gwynne, died on the 14th of August 1992, one day after the 28th anniversary of that morning, and a month after Albert Pierpoint. He'd never expressed a moment's regret. His execution diaries, the notebooks in which he recorded ages, weights, heights, and the arithmetic of the drop, were sold at auction in Cheshire in 2008 for £17,200. Somebody wanted them. And one last date, because it's the strangest of them all. The gallows at Wandsworth Prison, the last one maintained in working order in England, was kept tested and serviceable until 1998, 34 years after the morning this episode is about, against the possibility that Parliament might one day change its mind. In 1994, on the 30th anniversary, a Sunday newspaper went looking for the traces and did something almost none of the coverage had done in 3 decades. It went to Seaton and put Jack West back at the centre of his own story. The darts, the garden, the mother he had nursed, the breakfast laid ready in the pan. Evan's brother asked about it all, said the family did their best to forget. Their mother, he said, had carried it to her grave. And then in 2017, the files opened. A BBC journalist, Sancha Berg, checking newly released papers at the National Archives, came across Gwynne Evans' medical reports, the documents this episode and the last have drawn on, and showed them to a leading criminal barrister, John Cooper QC, and a consultant forensic psychiatrist at the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, Dr. Tim McInerney. Cooper's conclusion, on reading the 1964 papers, was unhesitating. Evans, he said, was a vulnerable individual, and that vulnerable individual was sent into court, into trial without the proper defence put forward for the jury to consider. A miscarriage of justice, not because Evans was innocent of the crime, but because the one defence the law had built for a man in his condition was never put. McInerney, for his part, had seen a case from 1963, a double murder no less, by a killer with a psychiatric profile similar to Evans', in which the defendant never stood trial at all and was sent to a special hospital instead. A year apart, a profile alike. One man in a hospital, one man in an unmarked prison grave. Cooper put the whole arbitrary machinery of those final months into one phrase. It had become, he said, in essence, a postcode lottery. Which prison you were in, deciding whether you survived. The last men to hang in Britain were not the worst men Britain convicted in 1964. They were the ones whose case fell in the wrong months, in the wrong category, with the wrong defence, before the wrong door closed. The 8-word note from the second day of the trial, defence advised dim res not being raised, Dr. Berg informed, was never explained in 1964, and the lawyers who could have explained it are gone. It sits in the file at Q, and it keeps its silence. The tower at Strangeways is still standing. We began this series beneath it 4 episodes ago, and I want to end there too, but by way of Cumberland, because the person with the strongest claim on the end of this story is the one it's always in danger of losing. Jack West did not die for the abolition of capital punishment. He did not die for a legal principle, or a parliamentary majority, or a place in the trivia questions. He died on his own stairs at 53 for £10 and a watch. A man who had worked 34 years for one firm, nursed his mother to her death, kept his garden, played his darts, laid out 2 strips of bacon for a breakfast he never ate, and extended his trust to one young man more generously than to anyone else in his life. Every consequence this series has traced, the last verdict, the last morning, the last entry in the long ledger of Strangeways, begins with him, in his hallway, in the dark. 100 people were hanged at Strangeways between 1869 and 1964, and this series has told the stories of 4 of them. The first man, the first woman, the last woman, the last man, and before each of them, of the people they killed, a fiddler, a daughter, a father and a friend, a widow, a laundryman. The building that did it is still there on Southall Street. It holds prisoners today. The graves inside its walls are gone though, the remains moved long ago to Blakely Cemetery. The gallows shed is gone, the trapdoors are gone. What remains is the tower, and the names at least are now said aloud. Patrick Nerney, Elizabeth Britland, Thomas Britland, Mary Dixon, Sarah Ann Ricketts, John Allen West. That's the story of the executions at Strangeways. Thank you for walking the path with me.